are listening to Lighthearted, the official podcast of the United States Lighthouse Society. My name is Jeremy D'Entremont. Welcome. Today is February 16th, 2025, and this is another episode of Hearted Lite, the series where we revisit interviews from the past 6 years of Lighthearted. In a few minutes, we'll listen to an interview with Shona Riddell, author of one of my favorite Lighthouse books, Guiding Lights. But first, we're going to hear a chat about an upcoming virtual conference the U.S. Lighthouse Society will be hosting in March. The conference will celebrate the 25th anniversary of the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act of 2000 and will feature a broad spectrum of presenters. Joining me for this discussion are Henry Gonzalez, president of the U.S. Lighthouse Society, and Kathy Fleming, who is the vice president. Let's listen to it now. I am speaking today with U.S. Lighthouse Society President Henry Gonzalez and Vice President Kathy Fleming. And we're going to be talking about something very exciting that's coming up, a virtual conference that relates to the NHLPA. And to kind of set the scene here, maybe Kathy, you could explain in relation to lighthouses, what is the NHLPA?
So the NHLPA, Jeremy, first, thank you for having us, is the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act, and it was passed as federal law in 2000. It's an amendment to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, and what it really does is provide a way for the federal agencies to dispose of historic lighthouses that they have owned, but that they've been declared excess to the needs of, say, the agency. Like the Coast Guard may not need them anymore, so they can declare them excess. And if they're eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, they can be conveyed under this program. It really recognizes the cultural and recreational and educational value associated with historic light stations and allows them to be transferred at no cost to either other federal agencies, to state or local governments, and for the first time really, which is unique about this act, to nonprofit corporations, educational agencies, or community development organizations. So it really enables sort of a public-private partnership for the preservation of lighthouses, and it's great law.
Can either of you tell me approximately how many lighthouses have been transferred under the Act since then?
So, Jeremy, there's been just over about 150 lighthouses, and the vast majority of those are offshore lighthouses. They're either on islands or on pierheads, or truly just standing out in the middle of a bay, or in fact, some are out in the ocean. Oh. And just want to add one little element to what Kathy was saying about the nonprofits. This act also enables private individuals to buy lighthouses. So first dibs in this process goes to government agencies, federal, state, or local, and nonprofits, kind of together as a group. Anybody can compete and submit an application for this. But if nobody applies for a particular lighthouse that is being accessed, then the federal government may decide to put it up for public auction. Okay. And that's managed out of the General Services Administration. And surprisingly, about half of the lighthouses that have been transferred have in fact gone to the public auction and are now owned by private owners. Now, some of those have established their own nonprofits as well to help bring in more people and manage them. But some of them have stayed entirely in private hands. So yeah, it's a great combination of trying to find new stewards to take care of these historic structures. Now, typically, the Coast Guard continues to maintain the aid to navigation in it because most of them are still used for navigational purposes. So it's really a matter of transitioning the historic structure into the hands of organizations that can focus more on that aspect and let the Coast Guard do their part, which is the actual aid to navigation to the mariners.
St. Augustine was part of that pilot program, and we actually had our aid transferred to us as well at the same time. But I think that's very rare even today.
Yes.
Some of the others have not had that happen in the early, in the early years.
So, could you please tell me about this interesting virtual conference that's coming up?
The idea here is, hey, it's the 25th anniversary, and we've had over 150 lights transferred through this act. This is a good time to celebrate. There's a lot of benefits that have come out of the act. There's been a lot of new organizations that have been taking on historic preservation of these lighthouses. Some have encountered some tremendous challenges and have conquered those challenges. And so the idea was, let's get together owners of these NHLPA lighthouses, as well as the government agencies as a primary audience, to first and foremost kind of celebrate, okay, the fact that this has been a smashing success, right? And secondly, to share lessons learned, to have some of these owners of these lighthouses talk about, okay, here are the specific challenges we had, how we overcame them, and those lessons learned can be of benefit to other owners of these lighthouses, and not just NHLPA lighthouses, but lighthouses in general. Okay. And the other kind of goal here was to strengthen networking, okay, by having all of these folks participate, share their lessons learned, not only among themselves as owners of NHLPA lighthouses, but with the lighthouse community in general. Okay, because the conference is now open for registration to anybody that wants to come, basically. This allows folks to strengthen their networking, to get to know each other a little bit better. And so next time somebody, has a challenge that they're really wanting some help on, they can say, hey, I heard this other group at the NHLPA conference talk about how they addressed that challenge. I think I'll give them a call, see if they can point me in the right direction, give me some tips and that kind of thing. So that's what we're trying to accomplish here is celebrate, share lessons learned, and strengthen networking across all types of owners, the government agencies, the nonprofits, and the private owners as well, Jeremy.
Can you tell me again when this is happening? And part two, what are some of the speakers or components that are planned?
Well, it's happening March 25th, 26th, and 27th. And we're starting at an East Coast time at 11 a.m. So that the folks on the West can also join us. And we're going to run until about, I think, 6 o'clock East Coast time.
Yep.
And there's some really great speakers. I don't know, Henry, if you want to talk about some of those.
Yeah, sure. So we've got a good diversity of owners that will be presenting, and geographical representation, as well as the kinds of lighthouses. So we've got a couple of folks that have lighthouses on islands. One of them pretty darn remote. We've got Jeff Erickson from the Five Finger Lighthouse Society out in Alaska. And their island is Five Fingers, about 35 miles away from their closest port where people live, right? And so that's pretty remote. We've got some that are relatively close to shore, like Baker's Island up in Massachusetts, and a couple of breakwater pierhead type lighthouses, like the folks out in Fairport Harbor in Ohio. Okay, that's another one we're having. But we also have got some private owners that have done some very interesting things with their lighthouses. We have the Frying Pan Shoals Lighthouse, which is, if I recall correctly, about 30 miles offshore of North Carolina in the Atlantic Ocean. Richard Neal, the owner of that lighthouse, private owner, but he established a nonprofit for that. The Frying Pan's Tower nonprofit. He's going to talk about his challenges. We've got folks from Lake Michigan coming as well. And then the government folks. We've got folks from the Coast Guard that are going to present from their perspective on how the NHLPA has helped them. And we've got a guest speaker, keynote speaker, the what's called the chief engineer of the Coast Guard is going to be our guest speaker on the second day, Rear Admiral Amy Grable. And the Park Service is also going to be talking about different kinds of grants that are available for lighthouses. And now more specifically to the NHLPA process, they're going to be talking about some of the typical issues that they've encountered in reviewing the applications. If the applicants were to understand this, it might make the application writing a little bit easier, as well as the evaluations a little bit easier. And finally, we're going to be talking about coming attractions. What are some of the planned lighthouses to be transferred in 2025 and hopefully into 2026 as well? And it's also an opportunity for feedback from the owners and to talk about potential process improvements where we could give feedback to the federal agencies that manage the program, which are the U.S. Coast Guard, the National Park Service, and the General Services Administration. So it's quite a diverse group of folks as far as the lighthouses, the organizations, the types of organizations, and as well as mixed in with some of our government agencies as well.
Well, sounds great. And you've got a number of people and places that are near and dear to me, good friends who've done fantastic things with these lighthouses. Bob Trapani of the American Lighthouse Foundation, I know, will be speaking about Little River Lighthouse, and John Potford from Thomas Point Shoal, Dave Waller, the owner of Graves Light, and on, Tim Petty at Greens Ledge. So what a great slate of people. So I'm looking forward to it, that's for sure. And as you said, it's not just people who've been involved with the NHLPA, but Lighthouse fans in general, I think, would find this really interesting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, anybody's welcome to register to attend. The information is available. Let's see, Kathy, it's on our website, is it?
Yes, it's on the website, right on the homepage. Yes, USLHS.org.
When is the deadline again for registering?
2 weeks before. There is a registration fee. It's going to be on Zoom. And so there is a nominal registration fee of $35 for folks, or if you're a contractor and interested, it's a $50 fee. And we're also looking for potential corporate sponsors. We have a few already, but we would welcome any other corporations, private sector corporations that are doing historic lighthouse preservation work. Feel free to contact us. We'd like to welcome you and show you some of the benefits of being part of this virtual event.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And at the end of the day, each day we have a virtual networking session that's going to be held. So people will be able to talk to each other and kind of meet up online, which I think will be beneficial for everybody.
This sounds great. It really sounds great. A lot of valuable information and entertaining talks and so forth. So very much looking forward to it. I hope a lot of our listeners will be attending. But thanks so much for doing this today.
And thank you, Jeremy, and keep doing this great job with the podcast. This is a very important part of our outreach and of our mission and vision at the U.S. Lighthouse Society. So thank you.
Again, to find out more and to register for the National Historic Lighthouse Preservation Act virtual event, go to uslhs.org and look under events. As we said in the discussion, this is something that's really of interest to Lighthouse fans as well as owners and managers. Next, we're going to hear an edited version of an interview with author Shona Riddell that was originally featured in episode 82 back in September 2020. Shona lives in Wellington, New Zealand, and her 2020 book, Guiding Lights, shares the stories of lighthouse women from around the world and through the centuries, including heroic female keepers, isolated families, and dedicated caretakers. Keat Books, at least I think that's how it's pronounced, Kete, in New Zealand, said this about Guiding Lights, quote, "This is a book that celebrates women's capability and determination while maintaining a sense of humor and humanity about its subjects. The lives of the Lighthouse women were and are extraordinary, and so is this treasury of their stories," unquote. Let's listen to my conversation with Shona Riddell now. Let me ask you, first of all, what led you, or what was your inspiration for writing a book on women at lighthouses?
Well, I'm definitely interested in remote locations and people who live and work far away from everyone else and challenging conditions. So that was definitely part of it. But also here in Wellington, where I live, there used to be New Zealand's first and only female lighthouse keeper, whose name was Mary Bennett. And she was a lighthouse keeper in the 1850s and 60s for 10 years. And she was a widow with 6 children. So she was solo parenting and running this lighthouse by herself. So I became very interested in her story and how she came to be there and running a lighthouse. And I also was interested that she was the only one in the country, the only woman who was officially appointed lighthouse keeper. And so then that took me further abroad. And I thought, well, if there were women like Mary Bennett running lighthouses, there must have been some women in other countries as well. What particularly surprised me was how many were not only at lighthouses, because I knew there were lighthouse families and wives of male keepers and daughters who did a lot of important work, but particularly women who were officially appointed by the government as official keepers. And I was interested to learn about Stephen Pleasanton in the 1820s and to the 1850s, who was the superintendent of lighthouses. And he seems to have been quite a conservative, practical person, but he actively championed widows being appointed keepers. And obviously that was more for pragmatic reasons rather than a desire to break through glass ceilings or anything. But it must have been a lifeline for these widows who had suddenly lost their husbands, or having this opportunity to run the lighthouse where they'd been living and look after their families there. And apparently they all did a fantastic job, and a lot of them were commended for their hard work. And the other thing that surprised me was a lot of them were given equal pay. So even now in the 21st century, that's still a matter of debate. And we're talking about the early 1800s when, women didn't even have the vote. And yet these particular women were given management positions, effectively running these lighthouses.
Our country, the United States, had far more women keepers than any other country. That's a correct statement, right? I mean,
yeah.
Which is very interesting. And the fact that, we'll talk about Ida Lewis in a few minutes, but she was the highest paid lighthouse keeper in the country, more than any men in her time.
That's right. And she was paid partly because of her work in rescuing, wasn't she? So it was sort of an added duty that she had.
But those women, and I'm sure they didn't see themselves that way, but in a sense they were trailblazers of a sort, even if they didn't realize it at the time. You have a substantial chapter on Grace Darling, the English lighthouse keeper's daughter at the Longstone Lighthouse in England. She, of course, was involved in a rescue in 1838 that made her famous around the world. Again, she was a keeper's daughter. She wasn't a keeper herself, but she was celebrated around the world. She was in her early 20s when the rescue happened and became very famous. Why do you think the story of Grace Darling captivated people so much at that time?
Well, I think at its core, it's a story of heroism and bravery. So this idea of a young girl or young woman in her 20s rowing out with her father to rescue shipwreck victims and literally saving lives. It's a great story, but I think at the time also Grace Darling embodied a lot of the characteristics that were valued in Victorian society. So she was, family was important to her and duty was important. And because she'd grown up at lighthouses, she was obviously quite sheltered. So her values were about being, doing as she was supposed to and following her duty and kindness. And so I think it was an inspiring story, but also as a person, I think she was greatly admired because she was obviously very modest, and all the sudden attention took her completely by surprise. It was obviously very difficult for her because she was completely unprepared for it, and she became sort of almost symbolic. But yeah, I think I think she was admired, but also under a great deal of strain. And when you read the story, I don't know, it sounds like she was taken advantage of by people who were, trying to make some money and trying to benefit from that exposure. So she was obviously an incredible person to row out and save lives. And I know she encouraged her father to row out in, pretty stormy weather. So the story itself is pretty incredible, but, and then she only lived a few more years. I think all the fame and attention took its toll.
And speaking of Grace, Ida Lewis in Newport, Rhode Island in the late 1800s was often referred to as the Grace Darling of America. She's probably I would say not only the most famous woman keeper in American history, but probably the most famous lighthouse keeper in American history. I can't think of any men who are better known than her. And she was also one of the most famous women in the U.S. in the late 1800s. Why do you think Ida Lewis became so famous in such a big way?
I think for similar reasons, in that she was performing very similar work. She was running the lighthouse with her family, and also she was rowing out to sea, in quite sort of cold, stormy weather and saving lives. Although unlike Grace, she performed these rescues again and again her whole life. I think, her first rescue was as a teenager, and then in her 60s, she was still rowing out to fish people out of the water who got into trouble. So there's definitely a parallel between them. But on the other hand, Ida Lewis, A, she lived a lot longer than Grace, and B, as you said, she was appointed a keeper in her own right, and paid a lot of money for it, which at the time was quite remarkable. And again, I think her story captured the public imagination. Having said that, for a long time her rescues went unacknowledged, didn't they? And it was only at one point where one particular rescue got into the papers, and then the story spread. And then she received similar levels of attention to Grace, in that there were marriage proposals and gifts and money and awards. And so all that must have been completely overwhelming as well, I imagine. But perhaps because Ida Lewis was slightly older or just a different character, she was able to take it more in her stride, although I'm sure at times the attention became quite wearying.
Who were some of the other United States women lighthouse keepers that you found most interesting?
Well, Kate Walker springs to mind. So she was the keeper at Robbins Reef in New York, and I sort of related a little bit to her story, not because I've ever been a lighthouse keeper, but because she was a mother of two. And when she arrived at the lighthouse, I remember reading that she was about to give birth to her second child. And of course, she'd never seen this lighthouse before, and it was surrounded by the water with not even a bit of land for the garden, and she loved gardening. And I suppose I really felt for her, just because I could almost see it, the idea of arriving at this tiny lighthouse and not even with a garden, and just having to adjust to that life. And even though she was so close to, a bustling metropolis in New York, her life was completely isolated. And I know that she came to love it. And of course, she was eventually appointed keeper, and she didn't want to leave. So that was one story that I enjoyed. And another was Harriet Colfax at her Michigan City lighthouse. And what interested me, I suppose, was that she wasn't a widow or a daughter of a keeper, but had independently decided to become a lighthouse keeper, which at the time was possible. And obviously she had worked very loyally for a long time. At one point, I know she was considered the oldest and the longest working lighthouse keeper in America. In the
50 years, right?
Yeah.
50 years.
Yeah, in the early 1900s. And just her dedication seemed extraordinary, that, every night she was lighting more than one light, wasn't it? Because she had to cross the stormy pier, which was often slippery and had large waves crashing over it. And so even though she wasn't famous in the manner of Ida Lewis, for example, she was a real hero, wasn't she?
Oh, she absolutely was. So let's go back to Mary Jane Bennett. You mentioned Mary Jane Bennett in New Zealand earlier, and she was the first and only woman lighthouse keeper in New Zealand, right?
That's right.
And I understand you also have a personal connection to her. What is that?
So yes, while I was researching the book, I found that her youngest son, William, is a great-great-uncle. And I always enjoy having family connections in my books. it makes it feel more tangible to me and resonate a bit more. Mary Bennett's story is quite fascinating to me because she grew up in England and she was the daughter of quite a wealthy squire in Yorkshire. So she'd had a very comfortable upbringing. And then a tradesman named George Bennett had arrived on the estate to do some work. They took a fancy to each other, and her father frowned on the relationship because, of the class difference. But obviously they were determined to stay together because they both sailed to New Zealand on separate ships. So not quite eloping, but when they arrived in New Zealand, they got married. And so that's how she came to be here. And then about 10 years later, he was offered a job at Pencarrow Lighthouse, which at the time was brand new. And when I say lighthouse, it wasn't a tower, it was a 2-room wooden shack with a lantern in the window facing out to sea. So it was not the most effective lighthouse. And it sounds pretty grim, to be honest. They had a few children by then, and it was freezing cold. And whenever there was a storm, they had to evacuate and go and shelter in a makeshift cave nearby in case the house blew away. And then just a few years later, poor George, her husband, was rowing back to the lighthouse with supplies when his boat overturned in strong winds and he drowned. So like other female lighthouse keepers, that's how Mary came to be appointed as the official keeper of Pencarrow. And by all accounts, she did a great job. So she kept meticulous logs and did her job effectively. And this was all while raising her 6 children, because when George drowned, she was pregnant with her 6th child. And her baby that she had was William, who was my great-great-uncle. And so Mary ran the lighthouse for 10 years and then returned to England with her children to give her sons an English education, I think. But just 5 years later, all 3 of her sons came back to New Zealand, so they must have really missed the life over here, and William became the assistant keeper at the same lighthouse. So there's this real sort of intergenerational feeling of, multiple Bennetts running the same lighthouse, which is, I think, is really cool.
Yeah. I understand there's another lighthouse keeper in your family tree as well. Can you tell me,
Yes.
tell me about that?
So I found another one. So his name was John Rayner, and he was a lighthouse keeper for 40 yees at various lighthouses around New Zealand in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And one of the lighthouses he worked at for several years is at Pusica Point, which is one of the southernmost, most remote and I'd say challenging lighthouses in New Zealand. Very cold, difficult to reach, and rainy much of the year, very exposed. So life sounds like it was very difficult there for the early keepers and their families.
There's a lot in your book about various aspects of life at lighthouses. You go into a lot of detail, which is great. What do you think were some of the most difficult aspects of life at lighthouses?
Well, certainly in 19th century lighthouses that were remote, I can imagine just the sporadic delivery of supplies must have been one of the greatest challenges that they faced, because their supply boats would be held up by bad weather and they would never quite know exactly when these supplies were going to arrive. So they had to depend very much on themselves and be incredibly self-sufficient. Of course, medical emergencies must have been a real challenge. It's not like they had medevac helicopters the way we do now. And so I have stories in the book of mothers and lighthouse keepers having to stitch their children's ears and, bring out the lighthouse medical box and dig into it and just do whatever they could in the moment to handle illnesses and emergencies. It's pretty incredible to imagine these days. I know you've interviewed lighthouse keepers about loneliness, and I know some people thrive on loneliness, but I can imagine for other people it would have been a real challenge, especially in the days before telephones and let alone internet.
You have a chapter in the book on ghost stories and other legends and mysteries at lighthouses.
Yeah, so with the ghost stories, I wasn't planning on writing a chapter about ghost stories, but then the more I read and researched, the more I realized that these stories are a part of the lighthouse history, because they involve real lighthouses, but often real keepers or people who visited the lighthouse, and maybe the stories have become embellished or exaggerated over time. But yeah, they're still quite fascinating, and they're important for the preservation of lighthouses today because they draw so many visitors. I suppose one that I particularly was interested in was the one about Theodosia Burr, who, if anyone's seen the musical Hamilton, they'll know she was the daughter of Aaron Burr, the third vice president, who shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel of honor. And Theodosia Burr married a governor in South Carolina, but she was visiting, or she was supposed to visit her father in New York. And so she boarded a ship, but her ship went missing and was never seen again. And there were theories about what happened to her. Perhaps the ship was wrecked in a storm, perhaps looted by pirates, perhaps she was kidnapped. But there were sightings of her ghost around Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. So, yeah, I think I was particularly interested in the Burr-Hamilton saga and this idea of poor Theodosia wandering the beach looking for her possessions on this wrecked ship.
You also cover the transition that's taken place in relatively recent years as lighthouses have been automated and some of them discontinued. What is your feeling about this transition?
Well, in an ideal world, I'd like lighthouses to have keepers in them because, I think keepers have always played an important role. But speaking pragmatically, I know that technology evolves, and so it's not surprising given the changes we've seen over the centuries and millennia that lighthouses continue to evolve in different ways, I suppose. It's a really important part of our history around the world. Countless lives have been saved by lighthouses, and they really have shaped the world. And it's important that people can continue to visit them and learn from that history. I know that there are many lighthouses around the world that are being taken care of, but of course the flip side of that, we are losing lighthouses. Some are being demolished, some are being destroyed by the weather. Although I was interested to read that some lighthouses are physically being picked up and moved inland to extend their lives a bit longer, which is a pretty fascinating exercise, I imagine, to lift an extremely heavy tower and carry it inland. But I'm so pleased that all this work has been done to preserve the lighthouses.
Shona, you wrote in your book that when you were working on a book about lighthouses, people would light up, quote, light up, when they heard that's what you were working on. Why do you think people react that way? What is it about lighthouses that captivate people so much?
Well, like you said, I think lighthouses are romantic locations, and a lot of people have an association with a particular lighthouse. I've noticed that when I talk to people that they usually have a story they like to tell me about a particular lighthouse they visited or a particular book they read that they really enjoyed. The other thing is that lighthouses are kind of universally recognized. I think everybody knows what a lighthouse is, regardless of which country they're from or which language they speak. Everybody knows what a lighthouse keeper is and the sort of work that they did. Although having said that, I didn't really know the details of the job, which I do now. But yeah, there's just sort of this appreciation and respect for lighthouses, I think, and they're very comforting. And I think it was the historian Edward Rowe Snow in America who said that lighthouses are altruistic symbols for mankind, that, they were built to protect and to guide, which particularly now or whenever we're going through challenging times, it's just a very comforting idea of these lighthouses in the darkness guiding us with their beams.
Do you think you would have liked to be a lighthouse keeper yourself?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the location and the era. So I don't think I would have enjoyed being a lighthouse keeper in the 19th century in a very remote lighthouse. I think that I would have found that very difficult. But certainly now with, the increased connectivity that we have, and I definitely would like to spend a summer as a lighthouse keeper, probably not my entire life. I'm quite a solitary person and I like being near the ocean. So yeah, there would definitely be some pluses, but I think I also enjoy getting a full night's sleep and modern comforts.
Yeah. I have one more question for you for bonus points.
Okay.
What was your favorite part about working on this book?
Oh, my favorite part. Well, speaking broadly, my favorite part is just the opportunity to travel remotely, especially this year when many of us don't have the opportunity to travel. And I just love learning about new places and reading specific details, because history books can be quite dry with a lot of facts and figures. And I certainly have those in my book too. But what I'm interested in is, what did it feel like to live in those places and to work there and raise families and to save lives. And so really my favorite part was just learning more about these particular women. So I'd heard about Ida Lewis and I'd heard of Mary Bennett, but to really get the opportunity to dig deeper, I suppose, was my favorite part. I call it the rabbit hole of research because, you could do it forever and you never quite know what direction it's going to take you in.
That's a good thing. You want to get lost in that rabbit hole for a while. So, Shona Riddell, I thank you so much. It's a pleasure meeting you and talking with you tonight. It's really a pleasure. And you've done just a wonderful job with this book. I think it's a welcome addition to Lighthouse literature about women at lighthouses, but just for anybody interested in lighthouses at all, they have to get this book. So,
thanks very much.
Congratulations on the book. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure speaking with Shona Riddell back in 2020, and it was fun to revisit the conversation. Guiding Lights is one of my favorite Lighthouse books, and I recommend it very highly. It's available from Amazon and other online booksellers, and you can buy it directly from the publisher at exilepublishing.com. That's spelled EXISLE, publishing.com. It's also available as an audiobook and as an ebook. We will be back with a new episode next week featuring California author and historian Desiree Hevereau. Until then, to all our regular listeners and our new ones, thanks so much for listening and keep a good light.
Everywhere I go, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.